You're watching Experience Comic Culture and Sales. Streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
Hello, ghouls and goblins. Welcome, creatures of the night. We're here for a spooky, tricky treat tonight. That's right, I'm dressed up in costume as the scariest thing of all, a wannabe comic book influencer on YouTube. And I'm here tonight to talk to you about some of the scariest comic books of all time, or at least the best ones for Halloween. So that's right, settle in, grab your popcorn, maybe turn off the light, hold your loved ones tight, because we're going to be talking about the best comic books for Halloween of all time. Hello, everybody. I am Bronze Age Nerd, one of your hosts tonight, and I am joined by not Dan over there, which is also producer Kyle. And happy Halloween Eve. That's true. I can verify that.
Happy the day before Halloween.
Yeah.
You can tell it's a good day before Halloween when you get to talk to a Michael Myers, which we did earlier today on Jen's show, with Tyler Main.
Go check it out.
Yeah, always a good time
for the show
when you get to talk to a Michael Myers. But also,
I will be spending Halloween talking to a Michael Myers tomorrow at noon Pacific.
Yeah, it's also always a good time when that dude has Kevin Nash stories to ravel your own Kevin Nash stories.
That's got to be fun.
So because they were tag team partners at WCW, so it's like this whole thing that winds up being a really fun day, even though you're like, I'm exhausted now, and we still have to talk about scary books.
Well, and so here's some framing for everybody in the audience tonight. We talked about doing this topic last week. We want to do something fun, something festive, something seasonal for Halloween, of course. And Kyle had this wonderful idea. He's like, how about the top 10, best horror comics? And the problem with that is it would be a very one-sided conversation because I'm not very big into horror comics. I'm not big into the horror genre in general when it comes to movies or even books. It's something I'm definitely trying to change. It's something that I'm working on, and I'm trying to expand my horizons. So tonight's going to be a good show for me because I'm going to get some good recommendations from hopefully the chat, some great recommendations from Kyle. And I'll talk about some of my comics that are kind of spooky themed as well. And, I got a list together, but I'm definitely excited to see what you guys all have to say.
Yeah, and the problem with my list is this. I didn't want to go all old books that are going to be hard for you to find. I didn't want to go all new books, which are going to be easier but still hard for you to find. And I didn't want to just be like, look. I didn't want to be like, have you read Sandman? Read Sandman. Like, there are plenty of spooky and horror books that are all seasons. So I tried to keep mine to the books that I felt were Halloween specific or Halloween movie adjacent.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So, serial killer movies or slasher books or whatever. So that kind of thing is kind of where I based my list. And there are so many others that aren't on the list that are like some of my favorite comics of all time that I did not include. So we're going to kind of talk through this, and we made Jay make a PowerPoint. So that we could go in an order.
Although that's actually, were yours ranked? Because mine are in no particular order.
No, mine are in no particular order.
Okay, good.
If I had to rank them, I would get very frustrated very quickly.
Yeah, that was going to be an effort.
They're in the order that I saw them.
Perfect.
Okay. So first up is Nosferatu by Joe Hill. Okay. Everybody knows who Joe Hill is, right? I had to be like, you know who his daddy is? It's Stephen King. So, anytime you have a Joe Hill book, the horror cred is strong. And then when he takes a pass at a modernized version of the classic Nosferatu vampire story, that's where you start to get, that's where this book is. So something that you may be familiar with in terms of Halloween, and that's a different Joe Hill, Preston. But when you start to talk about horror concepts that people are familiar with, many are familiar with Nosferatu.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Criterion Collection film. It's one of the classic silent horror movies. And then Joe Hill takes the whole thing and puts it in the 1920s with a steampunk vibe.
Okay.
So you have this concept that everyone is familiar with, moved up in time and given a whole new life. And so that's why this is always on my list. Joe Hill is Stephen King's son.
Yeah.
So DNA Stephen King. Anyway. Also, Stephen King's real name, I think, is Joe. Anyway, but that's not important. So that's why I start with this book, right? It's something that's easy to grab onto, and it's more relatable because this feels like Nosferatu meets like the Untouchables.
Okay. So my question for this book is, now, is this a total reimagining of the Nosferatu tale, or is it a continuation or somehow kind of a sequel? Okay.
It's a none of those.
Okay.
It literally is what would happen if this classic story that was public domain by this point anyway happened at a different time period. It wasn't Victorian, or it wasn't Edwardian, or it wasn't
Gotcha.
Gilded Age. It was gangsters.
Roaring 20s. Yeah. Okay.
Right? And people are trying to kill Nosferatu with a Tommy gun and stuff like that.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. Really fun book. And I'll be honest, not something that's on the top of any list of Joe Hill things to read. Not because it's not good, just because Joe Hill, I mean, like, if you could read this or Lock and Key, most people are going to read Lock and Key. You know?
Right, which I mean, and spoilers, Lock and Key will appear later on the list, so that's yeah, 100%. But I mean, as enjoying that, I'd be curious to read something like this as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, great recommendation. And then I was trying to look it up real fast, but there's another interesting bit of Stephen King's son trivia, which is the Cobra character Crystal Ball is named after one of his sons, and I can't remember if it's Joe Hill or not, because Joe Hill's not. I believe that's not his given name. It's
not.
Yeah, so it's like his pen name, right? So
yeah.
Okay.
It's
anyways, that was
Nam to not Stephen King. So
right. His Nosferatu.
Right. Absolutely. All right. What's next on the list?
Love it.
Okay. Oh, so we're doing all of mine first, and then we're doing all of Bronze's.
Oh, I thought we were going to go back and forth.
Go.
I guess we should have specified.
Yeah, I probably should have given Jay some instructions. Oh, well. Where Monsters Lie. This came out this year. Kyle Starks. This is, if you haven't read it, which why haven't you read this? We've been talking about this book on this channel now since the day issue 1 dropped. But it's about a gated community where serial killers live. And it's about the little old lady and her helper who keep the community safe. This is basically a lesson on you don't poop where you eat. So the serial killers all live in a neighborhood, and then they have to leave the neighborhood to do their serial killing. And one day some kids get into the neighborhood, and essentially all hell breaks loose. Now, I will say this, the first volume latter means later, Jay. Later, second option. Anyway, so the deal with this book is that it's this right, I bet trick-or-treating in that neighborhood is an adventure. I wouldn't recommend it, but so all of the serial killers in the book are based on either real life serial killers or classic horror trope serial killers.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So they're all like, you've got your John Wayne Gacy's, you've got your, some
Dahmer.
of the others that, Jeffrey Dahmer, some of those others that you would recognize. But then there are other horror villains, essentially, like This guy, you can kind of see him in the top left-hand corner of the cover. Yeah, one has a name we can't say on the air. But that guy kind of is supposed to look like Saw from the Saw movies, or Jigsaw from the Saw movies.
Okay.
So, like, they're all recognizable characters, but they're all living in a neighborhood. These kids come in, all hell breaks loose. The book ends in a way that if Kyle Starks wanted to write another volume, he could. But if he doesn't, it's great, one way or the other. So this is one that, because it's so new and people could still find it relatively easier, I don't want to talk too much about the plot on, just for the sake of having it have some readability for people. But this book is bloody and violent and lovely. It's also hysterical. Yeah, it's also hysterical because Kyle Starks has a dark personality, a dark sense of humor. Very nice guy, dark sense of humor.
The concept of that sounds really fascinating, and I definitely could see that getting adapted someday, that kind of thing too. But I'm looking forward to reading that one.
Yeah, no, this is one that, like I said, this is a quick pickup, right? Your store should have back issues, your local comic shop, or, the trade is out, so you could probably get the trade as well. So it's got a lot of those opportunities for readability on this one.
All right. I love it. So far, you're batting 1,000, man. These are both good recommendations I'm interested in.
Next up, please. All right, this is another new one. This is another one that's just recently out. This is Justin Jordan. How do I explain Harrower? You see that guy in the back with the scythe?
Mm-hmm.
He does some stuff to some people, man.
That sounds fascinating.
Right. Basically, the rumor in this town, or the town folklore, is that I don't remember, Jay, and you might remember, is it every year or every X number of years the Harrower comes and there's an amount of death. And people just have become accustomed to it, and you just pray that you're not part of it, right?
So it's like a literal reaping, kind of.
Yeah. However, this particular year, some stuff doesn't go normal, and the Harrower maybe has a little bit of assistance that you aren't really aware of, and there's more killing than you expect. And it all comes to the end of a giant M. Night Shyamalan twist that really, really took this book from good to fantastic.
Is it that his weakness is water?
No.
Okay. Just checking.
I will say the word cabal came to mind. The word inside job came to mind. The word holy crap, what kind of town is this came to mind.
That's multiple words.
I understand.
I know,
but it was breaking my rhythm.
Yeah.
But no, this book was great, and Justin Jordan absolutely crushed it. And again, this is another one of those bloody but beautiful books.
Okay, and this sounds like a little bit like kind of the less you say, the better, so you can't really get too far into it. One of those kind of things.
I'm treading dangerously close to telling you the twist, telling you that this is a much more accurate statement than you think.
Okay.
Yeah, go into it blind and it will help. Like I said,
All right.
This is another one of those that, again, it just came out this year. This should be in back issue bins right now, or trade paperback is coming or is out. So I don't want to, unlike Nosferatu and some of these other books that I'm going to really dig, I can really talk more about the plot and the story. Because these are so new, I want to give you an opportunity to go find them and read them.
Gotcha.
Whereas,
how long were each of these? Like, is this like a 6 or 12?
Where Monsters Lie was like a 6 issue. This was 5 or 6.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
these are short little mini series. And again, both books, in my opinion, Where Monsters Lie and Harrower were left open to another volume could follow. They don't have to. They both wrap up in very fun ways, but they left it just broad enough that you could say, you know what? Harrower Volume 2. More harrowing.
Harrowed.
Yes. Yeah, this is what's true. This is true. So at the time when these books came out, Jay and I were doing a show with Dan called In Stores This Week. And we read them, and very seldom did we all three like the same books. Where Monsters Lie and Hair Horror were two of those books that we all liked them, and we all would recommend them with our dollars.
Okay. Solid.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is the longest series on my list.
Yeah.
I mean long. American Vampire ran a long time. Oh, and hey, look who shows up. It's that Steve King guy. But this is Scott Snyder and Raphael Albuquerque. And the thing about American Vampire is it's essentially the Dracula story set in America, beginning in and around the founding and going up and through what I would call the 90s. There are issues that are supposed to be more modern than that, but they don't really read that way when you read them. So like you have a vampire in maybe not revolutionary times, but in the Old West. You have a vampire in the 18 teens during the Civil War, and then during the Civil War, and then you have a vampire that again is living here and feeding here and doing all of its things here in the 1900s and in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And so it's really this kind of big long through line following this vampire or vampire clan, depending on how you want to look at it. And again, this is Scott Snyder really before he was full Scott Snyder powers. Like this is the book that kind of got him that bag, or as it were. And while it's maybe not, if we had to rank these in terms of favorites, this would be probably my least favorite on my list. I think the importance of the story, because of one, the kind of story it tried to tell, the length of the story, the width, the breadth of the story, and what came out of it, right? Like this thing has been adapted 8 different ways. It's been brought back and killed off and brought back and killed off and brought back and killed off and brought. I own pages of American Vampire.
That's cool.
Like, yeah, I own some pages from backup stories in these books. Like, it's one of those books that has just become important for all of the things that came out of it.
Yeah. And American Vampire is the first book on your list that I have read, although I did not read all of it. And I'm actually excited to dive back into the rest of it. I've read kind of what I would call maybe the first major arc, probably.
This is the one book on this list that I would say, if you could find the Sparks Notes versions, where you, instead of reading all 700 pages or whatever it is, just read the highlights.
Yeah, I could see that too. Because I did lose a little steam with it, and it was more like I just moved on to some other things at the time. And I'd had, like, what it was is I had a bunch of issues that I'd pulled, and I often wait to read everything because I like to read things, kind of that binge style reading. And I did that, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. And then I just moved on to the next thing and kind of never went back. But
right. And that's kind of how this one is, right? Like, read some of it. You don't have to read it all. It's a fun vampire story. That's not your traditional vampire story, right? Like, it's not sparkly vampires, but it's not, okay. In the comic book world, this is as close to the Lost Boys. In my opinion, like in terms of it's a modern or a different take on a vampire story.
Yeah.
Whereas so often the vampire stories, like there's a Dracula coming out right now from Tinian that is literally set in the times when vampire stories are always set.
Yeah.
So many of these things so many of these books and stories are always set in the same time. So
yeah, 1700s, 1800s,
right.
or later, Gothic.
Right. All right. What's next? Okay. This is not the cover I would have chosen, but it's fine. 30 Days of Night by Steve Niles. 2 things about 30 Days of Night. 1, have you seen the movie?
Mm-hmm.
comic books more brutal.
Yep. This is also a book I've read.
Comic book way scarier. But here's why it makes the list. The first time I ever read the writing by a little author who I've become very good friends with and very close to, a guy named Dan Wickline, wrote a lot of the backup stories in these books later on in the series. And the thing about Dan's writing on this books is that it's not as scary as Steve's. So you can read this kind of legitimately terrifying front half. And then you get to this short little 6-page backup story that Dan has written, and it has more comedy. It has more, levity. Levity. It's a little lighter, still scary, but like
a palate cleanser, maybe.
Scream scary as opposed to Texas Chainsaw Massacre scary.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know any other way to kind of, analogize it, right? Like, it kept the books. The thing about 30 Days of Night is that every issue has something in it that keeps it from getting too intense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like the main issue knows when to let up and let the backup story kind of calm your nerves so you're not shaking. That
keep
kind
it grounded.
Yeah, that kind of palate cleanser, which I think is really nice. So that's why this made the list. Also, what I do is I take the first volume or the first, omnibus volume and read one chapter of it every week for the month of October.
Oh, cool.
So this is one of those things because of its size and its relative ease of reading. It's something that you can do like boom, 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 boom. And it could be a nice little, almost like my Halloween advent calendar is written by Steve Niles. Oh, and by the way, some of these, we, earlier had we talked about Joe Hill. This is Steve Niles. I'm recommending these books, but what I'm really doing is recommending these authors.
Right.
If you pick up another thing Steve Niles has written, it's also terrifying, right? If you pick up other things that Joe Hill has written, they are terrifying also. So just know that some of these, especially when we're talking bigger volumes, it's not so much the book as it is the writer themselves.
So on that point, because I don't believe I've read any other of Niles' work, what's your next recommendation that you would pivot off to since I have read 30 Days a Night?
Okay, let me, hold on. He just had a book come out recently that I was going to include on my list, but I couldn't remember the title.
Okay, fair enough.
It wasn't by a computer when I put the list together. So give me just a second here.
No, this should be exciting too when we compare lists early on. What is it?
Bryn Mawr is the series coming out right now. Bryn Mawr.
Okay.
BRYNMORE.
All right.
But he also had a book. He's done a lot of the Army of Darkness stuff at Dynamite.
Okay.
But he had a book called Criminal Macabre from Dark Horse Comics that is almost as long as 30 Days of Night. That I really, really liked. It's more of a it's less of a horror and more of a what's I'm looking for? True crime.
Okay.
But it's still pretty macabre. Still pretty dark. There's also a book called The Tripper that came out from Image that I had forgotten, Steve, as well. That is freaking scary.
Nice.
All right. Do I need to sell you guys on Philadelphia?
Sell me on Philadelphia. Somehow I've never read it, and I know I should probably be lynched for that.
Literally. The people in this book would. So just imagine the founding fathers are vampires.
I mean, that's pretty easy to do. No, I'm just kidding.
Sorry. No. So here's the deal with Philadelphia, and included in this is Nita Hawes' Nightmare blog, the Rodney Barnes horrors from Image. You have this alternative reality in which America was founded under different circumstances.
Okay, it's like alternate history story.
Yeah. like instead of the founding fathers just wanting to not pay taxes, they also wanted to drink your blood. And, you know, that kind of stuff. So it really isn't the story of them so much as it is the story of the people who try to bring the horrors to justice. So Nita Hawes is, you know, kind of a ghost hunter kind of type character. The main characters in Philadelphia aren't the founding fathers. It's the people who have sort of been tasked with controlling the outcomes that were started by those people.
Okay, so that's the impetus of the story, but you're dealing with the down the road implications.
Yes.
The founding fathers. Okay. All right.
Yeah, and again, this is another one of those I'm trying not to like I really want to just start talking about individual issues and individual story arcs. But I don't want to like take the fun out of reading this for somebody by telling them.
I mean,
this is always what I struggle with. This is always what I struggle with when we do shows like this, is right. Like, so do you remember in the one issue where Nita Hawes and, you know, then there was and then this thing happened and then that, and then let me tell you, I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler only because Rodney Barnes told me I could tell everybody. In the next volume of Philadelphia, Spawn and Savage Dragon show up.
Dope. I think
so.
Yeah, because Tom McFarlane's in a cover for Philadelphia before, right? So there's kind of some connection there.
Yeah, no, and they're doing a whole big crossover. It's nice. A whole thing. So just maybe read volumes 1 and 2, and then, you know, get ready for Spawn and, you know, whoever else might show up.
So I have a question about this one then. So from the setup of that story, it doesn't sound like this would be a spoiler. Does the population at large know that the founding fathers were vampires, or is that something that was more of like a, you know, conspiracy theory, secret society kind of a thing?
Without going too much into it, kinda.
Okay. It wouldn't be taught in history class that, you know, Thomas Jefferson was a vampire or something.
It might be taught in some.
Okay.
The other thing I'm trying to do is I've also read issues that aren't out yet because friends with Rodney. Fair. So, like, I also don't know where to stop talking about.
No, this is one that has been, regardless of the show, this has been on my to-read list for a while. I actually did not hear about Philadelphia until that Todd McFarlane cover came out. That kind of got my attention. But by then, I think that was like issue 12 or something, and it was hard to go back and find the floppies, right. And I'm sure I could find, you know, collected now. But
I missed issue 1, and my friends were like, dude, you got to read it. 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 And I'm like, okay, fine. Couldn't find a copy in 100 miles. And they did a local comic shop day version that I paid $25 for issue 1 for the local comic shop day variant. And I immediately reached out to a friend of mine who knows Jason Sean Alexander to get Rodney's email. So I could be like, dude. So.
Nice. That's awesome.
All right, up next. Do I have to sell you Neil Gaiman?
Sand Mahan? What is that? No, I'm just kidding.
And man. The ones I want to talk about for Sandman are particularly not the dream stories.
Mm-hmm.
The reason this makes the list is the dream stories can be scary and can be horror themed, but where you most often find the true horror in these books are in the stories, the interstitial stories.
Yeah.
So the diner story, the Night of the Cat story, the 24-hour diner. In volume 2, some of the things where the Julius Augustus story in volume 2, and some of this stuff is where the real horror can be, because when you're living in the world of dream, the suspension of reality kind of happens. But when all of a sudden you're with Julius Caesar begging for money because he has to keep the nightmares away.
Oops.
All of the sudden, that reality kind of sets in, and that's why I think the interstitial stories are so much stronger. While
Yeah.
dream is an important part in all of them, don't get me wrong, those stories tell more. There's a story in it. There's a story in volume 1 called Facade that is legitimately terrifying without being scary. And I think that's what Sandman brings to the table in this situation, right? Is it more than slasher, which a lot of my books have been. Big fan of the slasher books. This is a psychological horror. This is a horror that's going to mess with your brain. So Sandman. Also, on any list where you ask me to pick my top 10 of something, Sandman will be on it.
Yeah, I'm avoiding saying too much about it because this will definitely appear on my list, and I have a lot to say about Sandman, but 100%.
Yeah. Okay, Alan Moore's From Hell. This always makes my list because I read it entirely too young. This book started coming out in 1986, and I started reading it in about 1994. So I would have been about 6 the first time I picked up an issue of From Hell. And this was one of those comic book shops are not babysitters situations. My dad would let me ride my bike to the comic book shop. And, I would the owner was cool with me just kind of sitting there and reading and talking to him about what I was reading. And I bought stuff, but I was reading stuff I should never have read. And this is one of those. So Alan Moore, again, I shouldn't have to sell you Alan Moore. I shouldn't have to sell you Alan Moore From Hell. But this is, if the analogy I'd make to From Hell is if Alan Moore's Sandman or Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, wasn't a big green guy and was infinitely more murdery and had Alan Moore's outlook on existence, which is everything deserves to be tortured, that's the book. Also add in some demons and some devils and some dark magic and some Aleister Crowley of it all.
From Hell is related to Jack the Ripper, right? Okay. So yeah, I've never read this one, and this is one that it's just on my list as well, because pretty much any list you read of comics to read, this one shows up.
Right.
I'm trying to read through all the Alan Moore stuff anyway. So
right. So you could read The Watchmen. You could read his Swamp Thing. You could read all of that and never know how messed up Alan Moore is in the head until you read this and Cinema Purgatorio.
Okay.
Good luck finding Cinema Purgatorio. It was so disturbing. I don't think it ever got a mass market release, and I had to buy my copies from Kickstarter.
Wow.
So, I mean, like I said, it's one of those that it's, oh, I should go to a therapist after enjoying this book. It does, Triple B. I mean, not a direct adaptation. I wouldn't say the From Hell movie is a comic book movie, but there are certain elements that are crossovers.
Is that the Robert Downey Jr. movie? Oh, okay. So I have seen that. I professionally had to watch that movie, and I did not enjoy it that much, but
correct.
Yeah.
It's I'll be honest, this is not an enjoyable series. Or yeah, it's Johnny Depp.
Oh, okay, Johnny. Okay. Yeah.
It's not an enjoyable series. It's a scary series, and I love it. But I would not recommend this book to a normal person with the phrases, I really enjoyed it and I loved it. Look, just know what you're getting. And this is Alan Moore essentially taking his nihilism and putting it on Jack the Ripper and adding in dark magic.
Okay. That's a solid. I mean, you had me at Alan Moore.
So I'm saying I wouldn't recommend it to normal people, but this group, I got you.
Yeah, we're a bunch of deviants, so it's all right.
All right, what's next? All right, so Baby Teeth is not the book I put on the list except it is. Early Aftershock is what I put on the list.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Donny Cates' Baby Teeth. You have Pestilence from Frank Thierry. You have Pestilence is another one. Frank Thierry. There were some other ones that came out at this time that, again, it's names that I was like, what do I pick from Aftershock? But the whole idea for me, at least, is that Aftershock had a huge list of launchable stories that were scary. And I don't really know how else to put it, right? Like, they launched with a bunch of stuff that were legitimately frightening. Black Eyed Kids is another good one.
I thought you were just saying that because of Baby Teeth.
No, not at all.
Which is hilarious. By the way, I'm glad we have Psycho Phil here tonight, because if there's anybody that should be here, it's Psycho Phil.
Right. I'm just trying to think of some of the other ones from that first real wave of Aftershock, but they've always been great with horror. And so you had a lot of what I would call realistic horror.
Okay.
In those first few volumes, right? Those first few years of Aftershock, where it's Pestilence is a zombie uprising, but it's more somehow believable than The Walking Dead. In the sense that the premise makes a lot more sense.
Okay.
At least at first. Baby Teeth is, it's Rosemary's Baby meets Juno. Right? Like, Black Eyed Kids is American mythology. It's like, the Flesh Traveler, or, that thing, we're not going to say their name because then they'll show up. That thing that's on the outside of your body, and then the thing you do when you transport yourself via your feet from one place to another. Bunny Mask is another one. In terms of still going from Aftershock, there's a ton of great horror coming from there. But I just remember when they launched going, oh, so this is where I'm going to go for Cullen Bunn to scare the crap out of me. Got it. So.
Okay, if you had to pick one early Aftershock title to recommend, I know you're recommending all of it.
So, do you want a horror or just an Aftershock title?
A horror Aftershock title. I'll admit the idea of what you described. I'm a zombie guy, so Pestilence sounds cool. Does it take place in medieval times, or is this a?
So it's King Arthur meets a zombie uprising.
Okay, I'm sold.
Yeah. So the pitch I would get, and Pestilence is probably the one I'm going to pick. But for me, the sales pitch that I would give on Pestilence is this: you've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Imagine if they weren't actually seeking the Holy Grail. It was King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, the Knights Templar, all of those organizations are searching for the Holy Grail, which is essentially putting down a zombie uprising. That was their cover. They were on this mission from God, but what they were really doing was trying to stop the zombie uprising.
Got it. Okay.
Source Point Press is another one of those companies like Aftershock that when they launched strong with horror. I didn't include Source Point on this because Source Point has deviated so much from the horror, as has Aftershock, but they always come back to it at Aftershock a little more. So that's why this made the list. So I'm going to recommend Pestilence. A Walk Through Hell is very good. And there were some other ones that, again, it's, if I went next door and looked in the box of Aftershock, I could tell you. But the first Aftershock book I always recommend to people who aren't into horror is a book called Jimmy's Bastards. It's not horror, it's comedy, but it's very good. And that one is, if James Bond had a kid with every woman he ever slept with in all of those movies, and then never talked to those kids, there would be a legion of genetically predisposed to being awesome supervillains who are very angry at their father.
Okay.
So, all right, Silver Coin. And I'm glad you grabbed this one. So this is an anthology that's actually by an artist, not a writer. So Michael Walsh had the idea for Silver Coin, and he pitched it to a bunch of different writers, and then each writer took a story. And the premise of the Silver Coin is that it's cursed. When you have it, you're extremely lucky, or extremely good, or extremely something. And the second it's done with you or you're done with it, bad shiz happens to you. And basically, it's a story of essentially a coin being passed person to person for every issue and the inevitable, untimely deaths of all of these people.
Okay.
Next. All right. Okay. Junji Ito. This is a little bit outside of what we normally would talk about. This is manga.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll talk about this one the shortest. If you're looking for horror that isn't traditional comic book horror, check out Junji Ito's manga. He's a Japanese horror master. So think more like The Ring and less like The Shining.
Right.
And that's kind of the stories he tells in his very specific manga way. So that's why I included that. Like I said, it's one of those that I don't necessarily recommend to anyone necessarily, especially if they're looking for horror comics. But this is if you're looking for a different flavor of horror.
That's fascinating to me because I actually, my big problem with a lot of horror movies is I'm not a big fan of the jump scare. I'm not a big fan of, to me, you look, yes, it makes me jump. Yes, I watch it and I know it's going to happen. Yeah, there's the screeching violin music leading up to it. It just seems so cheap to me. I love movies that don't have jump scares that are still scary or still terrifying, that cerebral type of scary. So the idea of reading something from a horror master like that is not, a visual media or where I'm maybe getting that jump scare is pretty cool.
Right. I mean, and again, Junji Ito works from a whole different level of a whole different set of mythologies than we're accustomed to. So, Like I said, I like to call Junji Ito a different flavor of horror, compared to literally everything else on my list.
Right.
So,
I like it.
Yeah, there's one about a melting classroom. It's crazy. It's true.
What? Who put this crap on here? Just kidding.
Some guy who doesn't like horror, apparently.
So, welcome to my half list, Kyle. I'm extremely happy to hear your list.
I'm sorry, my list took 3/4 of the show.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It actually will be helpful for some of mine because some of mine I read so long ago that I don't feel comfortable, other than talking about how it made me feel or like the experience I had. I don't feel comfortable talking about the details of it. But Walking Dead is not one of those.
That was my problem with American Vampire and some of those. It's been a long time since I sat and read.
American Vampire is on my list, and it's one of the ones that I feel that way about. With Walking Dead, it's perhaps a very cliche entry. Not to be the hipster, but I read Walking Dead before it was cool. In some respects. Oh no! I don't want to get out hipstered here.
I bought Walking Dead #1 from Robert Kirkman at his artist alley table at New York Comic Con.
So you win, but then
I didn't read it again for 60 issues. So,
okay, so you win and you lose.
Yeah, I had to. I bought an issue 1, and then I had to go back and reread everything 2 on, 60 issues in. So
okay, well, but I started reading Walking Dead at issue 7. Which I mean monthly, which is pretty early. A lot of people were not reading it then. I mean, that's around the time it started picking up steam, though, for people because the word of mouth was spreading on it. And I genuinely enjoyed it. I feel bad that the show and I guess shows now are out there, and they kind of skew people's perception of The Walking Dead a little bit. A lot of people picked up The Walking Dead and I do enjoy binge reading comic books, but they kind of raced through them maybe a little bit faster. I liked reading it month to month. Although there were times where I did read, multiple issues at a time too. But I actually enjoyed having time to let each issue kind of sit for a little bit when I read this. I think some things like the Lost TV show and Walking Dead, they had that pacing that's better if you had a chance to kind of absorb it month to month, because Robert Kirkman, what he does that's so smart in The Walking Dead, what I enjoyed so much, not only is he going back to the whole kind of like 9-panel layout, not only is he making it, it's just dialogue, there's no narration, nothing like that going on. There's also this something absolutely crazy and heartbreaking and brutal and unexpected will happen. And then it's, almost like 2 or 3 issues of how are we going to find food, or how can everybody pitch in to make the perimeter more secure. And that's some of the best things about zombie movies are not just the ideas that the people are really the real enemy, which is always kind of the classic, tenet of zombie stories, but also that survivalist kind of instinct, like, how would I do in a zombie apocalypse? Well, it kind of explores that in how is a group important, and how are other kind of groups different from your group. And I love how it did that. It's fantastic. If you haven't read it by now, you're probably in the minority. So that's probably all I can say about that.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with The Walking Dead being on a list. I didn't put it on mine because I never really cared for The Walking Dead. I mean, I did. I read the books. I like zombie stories, but the show and the fervor around the show made me like it less.
Yeah, 100%. And also even the comic is a little long in the tooth too, if you go towards the later volumes.
Well, but when you're the guy who everybody knows is the comic book guy, and they're like, so on The Walking Dead, Daryl just, yeah. And I'm like, okay.
Daryl.
And they're like, where is that in the comics? And I go, nowhere.
But
and
is Daryl like, cooler what? In the comics?
Huh? Like, it takes the fun out of reading the book when you have to explain the book to everybody all the time. So
100%. And I mean, there's some good differences though. So if you did watch the show and you've never read the comic book, I do still recommend it, especially if you're kind of like done with the show and you've kind of had some time to let it settle and you're ready to move on. Speaking of ready to move on, I think we can probably move forward to the next slide. So this is something that I think a lot of people may not include as horror. To me, it is horror in kind of that science fiction horror genre. And I love, I am always fascinated by sexuality in fiction, sexuality in comic books. And this story does a fantastic job of taking that kind of male sex drive and exploiting it. If you're not familiar with the story, essentially one day in this small town, these women show up. They're naked, they look the same, and all they want to do is have sex. And well, some guys are gonna be more prone to taking that on, and it will have repercussions. And those repercussions will become violent and bloody. Not as much as some other things. This isn't the goriest story out there, but the idea of essentially everything gets walled off. You're stuck in this one town. It's kind of an under the dome sort of story. And when you get to the end game of all the repercussions of what these folks have done in this community, it is pretty scary. It's a scary situation to think about. And there's plenty of innocent people that are stuck in that same situation. It's a really great story. I recommend the Luna Brothers Girls, and I do recommend Sword as well. I think they were both great stories. Have you read Girls? Okay, there we go.
No.
Maybe you'll check it out.
But I remember when the solicitation happened and going, this is clearly not a book for me.
Fair enough.
But knowing a ton of people who would be super into it and being like, yes. So it's a book that I could totally respect and understand. But again, my horror leanings tend to be a little more slashery when it comes to comic books, or super psychological and a little bit less supernatural.
Yeah.
Is that a fair
way
to reference it?
I would. So I'm actually not a fan of I'm not a fan of supernatural ghosts and
or preternatural.
This is more, preternatural science fiction. Probably aliens. Let's put it that way. I think that's kind of what most people thought from the beginning. mythological, maybe even a little bit too, but it's cool. I recommend it. All right. I think we should move on to the next one. So this is probably another cliche choice. The opposite of The Walking Dead for me, because I got into The Walking Dead before it was cool, quote unquote, except for Kyle, who picked up #1 from New York City Comic Con with Robert Kirkman. I got into Something Is Killing Children way after it was cool. And I think I was like, I'm not going to read that. It's, everybody seems to just be all over it and whatever. And, it seems dumb. And it's weird because when I read this story, I can't actually tell you what it is that really hooks me, because it's not the idea of a bunch of children dying. I mean, that's terrifying. It's not really even that the concepts are necessarily amazingly original or fascinating in and of themselves. It's just the way it's executed is very cinematic. And it is one of the most cinematic stories I've ever read in a comic book. And I really, really fell in love with Erica Slaughter in a way that a lot of people have, and I did not expect to. I expected to think that character was really silly. If you like secret society stuff, I mean, if you haven't read Something That's Killing Children by now, I'm probably not selling you on it. So there's probably not much else I need to say, but it's a fantastic story. It's got, plenty of monster gore, which is really fun too. So recommend that one for sure.
Here's a Something Is Killing the Children pro tip. If you can make it to issue 20, you'll be in for the long haul. If you're like me and after issue 16, you're going, okay, this is starting to kind of lose me. Maybe stop, pick it back up, come back to it. Enjoy some of the books of Slaughter and some of the other things surrounding it, and let that reinvigorate your love for the main series. Because the main series, much like The Walking Dead, in my opinion, can get a little stiff.
Fair.
It can get a little hard to read. And at some points, it's felt like Tinian is writing so much stuff that he's not putting the time and effort in that he once was.
Yeah.
And usually for me, that's an indication of, one, that's not true, and two, that maybe I'm just burning myself on a series. So I always take a break, pick up some other stuff and come back to it.
I think part of what you touched on though is key though, because if you're reading a lot of stuff that one person's putting out that are different stories, you can kind of maybe get more burnt out on that person's style.
Oh yeah, no, I won't read anything else Tinian is writing right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's Something Is Killing the Children that came out last week was real good. And I only am able to appreciate it because I had taken about 3 months off from even looking at Something Is Killing the Children.
Fair enough. Next on my list is Sandman, also on Kyle's list. There's a few that we both had. This one is, so I told you at the outset of the show, everybody, that I am not a horror fan. And I wouldn't really classify Sandman as traditional horror in a lot of respects. But what I will say is that Sandman is the book that got me out of reading cape books, superhero specific books. I read G.I. Joe and stuff too. I don't really count that. I read, Sad Sack and all that kind of stuff when I was a kid. I mean, like, it's what got me out of traditional, Marvel, DC superhero books. And obviously Sandman is DC/Vertigo, but getting into Neil Gaiman, getting into his world, the way he tells stories, getting into, darker comics, getting into, it itself wasn't really an indie title, but it got me into indie titles. It's kind of the gateway drug of comic books for me. It's the #1 comic book I recommend to people who tell me they don't read comic books and they want to maybe try it or get curious about reading those types of things, because I think it has a appeal that is broad for a lot of people. Understood. And I'm going to take over here for a second for everybody. JD says, I feel like Nice House on the Lake is the same book as Something Is Killing Children, but without the powerful character to keep you reading. That's interesting. You know what? I've been meaning to read Nice House on the Lake. It's one of those ones where it's like, kind of like Kyle was saying earlier, I don't really want to read a bunch of Tinian stuff at the same time. And I'm kind of waiting to read all of it. I'm not like in any rush. I'm never in a rush to read comic books when they first come out. I'm just not that kind of person. I'm never in a rush to see movies when they first come out either. I got plenty of other stuff to read and watch in the meantime. But Sandman is a perfect gateway drug in terms of comic books, in my opinion. And I think it's something that everybody should read. And again, if you read the first few volumes and it's not for you, obviously bounce off of it. But but I think most people are going to enjoy it if they enjoy comic books. Okay, I think we can move on to the next one because Sandman's a pretty popular title, and this is American Vampire, and I remember very little about this book. I read it, right when it first came out, issue to issue. But what I will say is what I enjoy about American Vampire, zombies and vampires tend to be my two favorite horror things that are kind of like traditional genres within horror. I tend to gravitate towards those. I think there's some really good stories in both of those types of subgenres, or types of horror movies and types of horror comics. And what I liked about American Vampire is some of the characters had a lot of charisma. And having characters that have a lot of personal charisma, even if they're not necessarily good characters, even if they're not necessarily bad characters, in those traditional roles, you get invested in the characters. And if I'm invested in a character, that says a lot to me. Now, like I mentioned, I think like the first 20 to 24 issues on a pull list, and I was reading them. And then I took it off my pull list because I was getting too many comics I wasn't reading at the time. And I went back and I read them all, enjoyed it. Never picked up another issue of American Vampire again. Always felt kind of guilty for not doing that. I did move from American Vampire onto another Scott Snyder book. I started reading his Batman stuff after that because that was my order of reading Scott Snyder stuff. So that's probably why. Like, I tend to follow creators and then not backtrack too much into their catalog. But it's a great story, and I do agree that it's something that it's worth reading or at least checking out.
Two things. First, back on Sandman, because I walked away and I didn't mention it during my time with Sandman, but I'm mentioning it during yours. If you're reading it and you're struggling, but you're like, I love the concept, I'm into it, but I'm struggling to read it, some of that might be the Sam Keith art, because it can be a little jarring at times.
It's polarizing too.
Try getting the audiobook from Audible. It's a full cast recording, and listen to the audiobook while you read the book. It really helps. And then two, with American Vampire, if you find yourself struggling with American Vampire and you want to do pre-Batman Scott Snyder, look up Severed.
Cool. Yeah, it's all good stuff, and the thing about comic books is 85% of people can love something and you might not, and it's often the writing or it's the art. Painted style or that kind of, Bill Sienkiewicz, Sam Keith, like those kinds of art styles, they're not for everybody. Not, some people, they want more detailed, their Jim Lees and those types of things. And some people want, Joe Madureira anime style. Everybody has their own kind of things that they want from art. And a lot of people love multiple kinds of those. If you're ever bouncing off something like that, ask yourself what's most important to you in the comic book. For me, I like a good combination of both art and storytelling. So that works out. But yeah, I can see that. Okay, I think we should probably move. There we go. Ice Cream Man. So this is actually, out of everything on my list, this is probably the closest to true horror. This is an anthology series. It's very popular. I'm sure most people watching this will have read it. I'm a big fan of Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, Love, Death, and Robots is another good series that kind of falls into this vein. What I did enjoy about Ice Cream Man is, even though it's an anthology series, if you pay close attention, and eventually you won't even have to have paid that close of attention because it kind of hits you over the head like a hammer, there is some running themes that start to happen throughout the story. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed picking up on those themes. There are a lot of stories that I read within Ice Cream Man that truly creeped me out and truly made my, the back of my brain feel like it was crawling. And that is, to me, the best kind of horror. That's the kind of stuff that I really do enjoy, because it's kind of fun to play in that sandbox of feeling a little creeped out and scared. Very good. It can be a little dark at times if you're into just more slasher gore type stuff. It's probably not the best recommendation in that regard, but yeah, it's definitely got a lot of high-powered horror themes going on in it.
My Ice Cream Man story is I read issue 1 and never read another issue, because the way the artist draws mouths is actually more scary to me than any of the storytelling.
Yeah.
And clearly that's something in me that is an oddball thing, but it's It's strange.
No, you know what's funny is we were talking about Sandman, and some people bounce off of it because of the art. The art is my least favorite thing about Ice Cream Man. Now I think it serves the story well, and it goes because, like, if you're looking at the character, the main character on the cover right here, that's supposed to kind of creep you out a little bit, I think. Now I don't think that's necessarily what the artist intended. Why are all their mouths
exactly the same?
Yeah, exactly. Steve McNiven also kind of weirds me out in a similar fashion, by the way, when it comes to mouths. I don't really like the way he draws mouths, but
that's true.
Yeah, but it's a great story. It's worth reading, and I definitely think that if you're a fan of any of those other types of shows I listed, you'll enjoy this, if that's your bag. Lock and Key. So we had Nosferatu on Kyle's side. I went with the more traditional pick, Lock and Key, because I've read it, as opposed to the other one. And now I'm excited to read Nosferatu. But Lock and Key, very awesome. I was fortunate enough to have a coworker that let me borrow a volume of this. It was the first hardcover book, and I read that. And I actually didn't read any more of that just because it was something I borrowed. I enjoyed the hell out of it. Again, I'm one of those people, if I'm reading something and I move on to something else, I don't tend to go back very often. That's more of a me thing. It's not a reflection on the story. And then I'll be honest, my wife and I got invested in the show, and we've been watching that. And I think when we're finally done with the final episodes of the show, I'll probably go back and read more Lock and Key because I've been interested in reading the rest of it. But the premise is something that struck me as being so unique and original and fun. And I love the idea that there's kind of a theme that happens where kind of kids are playing at this sort of like Narnia-esque kind of power, and then get in over their heads. And that's a scary thought, like kids in danger because they kind of go beyond their ability level and the adults aren't really helping them. That's kind of where some of the horror of this kind of comes in for me, and I really love it. Preacher, a story that I had read, absolutely binged it, read the whole thing. I was just loved playing around with how twisted and dark it was. Like there's no limit, there's no border that can't be crossed. Cross is a terrible pun in this instance. It's a fantastic story. It is very, very dark. It's very adult. If you're not into that type of theme, you're probably not going to enjoy it. But again, another one that maybe doesn't really play in the traditional horror genre, but I think it fits right in, and you're going to enjoy reading it if you enjoy that type of content. It's fantastic stuff.
I read Preacher way too early. That's another one that maybe has defined my personality a little too much as the years have gone on, and might explain why I have some of the therapy sessions I have. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you get to our space and you're pretty much done. But yeah, so 30 days a night. Fair enough. 30 days a night. So 30 days a night is one of those stories that will go down for me, because the concept is so freaking fun. It is the perfect idea of telling a scary story, that, you're kind of trapped, you're cut off, vampires without a weakness, essentially, because of the situation. What I will say about this is it's probably my favorite bloody, gory, violent story on this list for sure. With possible exception of my next entry, I guess. But it's also the artwork. The Temple Smith artwork is just, it blows my mind. Love the story. I need to reread it because I remember very little of it at this point. I like the details. I don't remember, all the details of it. Definitely need to go back and read it. It's one of those things where like the movie has now kind of like overshadowed some of my like memories of this story. Is the chat down? No, it's up. It's up. We're here. But yeah, the movie is fantastic on its own. I think it's a really good movie. Underrated probably as far as in terms of feel. and being an adaptation. So I think it's fantastic. Sounds like we both like it. So there you go. We both recommend it. All right. Finally on my list, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. I had this fantastic history of having coworkers recommend good horror stuff to me. That was true of Sandman. It was true of Lock and Key, and it's true of Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. If you have a twisted sense of humor, if you enjoy, I would describe it as like maybe Tim Burton-esque, Edward Scissorhands, Beetlejuice, those sorts of plays on things. It has just this dark comedy, fascinating artwork. It's just a page turner where the first thing I ever do when I turn a page is I look at all the artwork really fast, and then off and I go start reading the story. Johnny the Homicidal Maniac is one of those stories where I would look at all the artwork really fast, and then I'd go back and look at it again in detail. The way figures are drawn, the way that the personality comes through in the artwork is something that's just worth studying every page. And really dark, twisted black humor, gallows humor kind of stuff. So if you're in the mood for that, pick it up. If that kind of stuff strikes you as juvenile or you don't like it, I would skip this one, to be honest, because if that isn't something that's interesting to you, you're probably not going to stick with this book for very long. But if you do, I think you're going to enjoy it. And this is one of those ones that if I recommend it to people and I tell you it's an amazing book and it's a real heart lifting story, you'd think I was a psycho. But it is dark. So be prepared for that. And I hope you enjoy it. And it's the last book on my list. I did have one honorable mention that I wanted to throw out there, though. It's not a horror book, but I can't talk about Halloween and comic books and not mention this. One of my favorite Batman stories of all time. There's about 5 that tie for top for me, though. It's a great story. Long Halloween. Definitely check it out. It's what the first Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale kind of collected book that I read, and then I went over and tried to grab everything they ever did at that point, or everything they did going forward. And just a perfect Halloween read, even though a lot of it's not necessarily about Halloween, but yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, no. So one of the only times in my life where I stopped reading comic books was because my mother made the mistake of picking me up an issue of Long Halloween when I was sick. And how do I put that? I was pretty sick, so my brain wasn't 100% right. I was running a pretty strong fever. I was having some hallucinations and stuff like that. And the way that it portrayed Harvey Dent as Two-Face, the way it portrayed Scarecrow on some of the covers, just terrified me so much. I stopped reading comics altogether for a while and could only get back into it through like Archie.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had to read the Archie TMNTs and the Archie comics and stuff to kind of get back into wanting to go to the comic shop and wanting to read comics, because this book, while not a Halloween or a horror book, has some elements that if you're susceptible to them can really freak you the hell out. And it makes for a really great story.
Well, that's I'm glad you said that, because I was trying to identify what really made it stick out to me when I was thinking about this list, even though it's not a horror comic, it's something that made me realize that I really like Batman in 2 different flavors. I really like the smartest man in the room, ultra detective, can think his way out of every problem, Batman. That's kind of become really popular in the comics these days. But I also realized I freaking love dark, grimy, gritty Batman. And, him having to go up against some of the darkest, craziest, deranged characters. And this kind of plays in that field. And I really enjoy that. Like it's by far my favorite Batman. I think it's something that when Batman does that, that's my favorite Batman, and it's something that I wish we could see more of. I'm glad that there's been a lot of self-contained kind of stories that have explored that kind of stuff, but not so much necessarily within the mainline Batman titles. And I hope we see more of it. And it's a fantastic read for Halloween.
Absolutely.
Cool.
So that was our least debatey episode ever.
Mm-hmm. A lot of agreeing.
Yes, a lot of agreeing.
Although I did notice something. There's a lot of books where I say, like, I loved this horror comic book. You're like, I bounce right off of that. So it is kind of funny how we have kind of maybe different tacks we take when it comes to horror comics. It's fun.
Yeah, and so much of there's stuff that I want to recommend so heavily that I can't, because you just can't get them. They're super indies. They're books that just aren't out there anymore.
Right.
And so, like, I tried to stick kind of mainstream here with my picks, right? I tried to stay kind of you'd be able to find them.
Yeah.
So that's part of this too. I had an honorable mention that I wanted to throw out there that's different from the Long Halloween, even though Long Halloween would have been mine had you not picked it. And that's a book that came out like right around 2016 or something, from Boom Studios, called Daymen. And it's about the families, like the, I don't want to say it out loud for fear they'll come after me, but they're made up of vampires as opposed to Sicilians.
Okay.
And the Daymen are the people who do their work during the day. So it's The Office meets What We Do in the Shadows meets Goodfellas meets Dracula.
Interesting. Sounds cool.
It's not necessarily scary as it is sort of like this mix of comedy and horror.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, like, like I said, a lot of the stuff on my list isn't necessarily what I would classify as strict horror, which is kind of why I'm approaching it from a slightly different angle. But again, I'm excited to read a lot of the recommendations that you brought forward. There were a couple in chat that I'm excited to look for as well. And thanks everybody for the recommendations. Hopefully you guys enjoyed some of ours. If you're watching or you're watching on the rewind, let us know in the comments what some of your recommendations would be or what you thought about our recommendations. We'd love to see it.
Absolutely. And then just as a heads up, guys, we will be back next week with another show. And then the week after that, we're taking a week off. We won't be devil's advocating for anything the week of November 13th.
Correct.
So just be prepared for that.
Yep. But catch us next week. Get your fix in before the slight break. And then we'll be back in 2 weeks after that for another show.
I've heard great things about Vampire Earth, but I've not actually read it. So
another good recommendation. Thanks a lot, guys and gals.
See you next time.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.